to Digit Debates. We're very pleased to have Pawel here today to talk about some of the structural changes they're observing with data from Indeed. And one of the reasons I wanted to invite Pawel is because we met just before the pandemic when he gave a great talk at Nesta about changing structure of the labour market and how you could use the data from Indeed to look at what demand for jobs there were in particular regions and what job offers there were and whether there was a mismatch there. And we've had previous Digit Debates from people from Tortoise talking about their AI index and looking at real-time measures, and Avi Prassel looking at burning glass. So alongside conventional ways of trying to understand the way digital work's changing, I thought Pawel has a great source of data here. So Pawel is the director of Indeed, which is a hiring lab, and he's also a research fellow in economics at Regent's Park College in Oxford. He's an economist by training and has a lot of international experience. So with no further ado, Pawel, I'd love to hand over to you. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you for inviting me to speak here today. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's a lovely sunny day here in Oxford after a very wet and dark morning. So I hope that you're enjoying a similar kind of day wherever you are. I'm going to share my screen and launch into it, the presentation. Hopefully you can see these slides. The topic that I'd like to talk about today is working from home after COVID-19. And as Jackie mentioned, I'll be drawing mainly on evidence from job postings on Indeed. And this is data from 20 OECD countries. The paper that I'll be talking about is a joint analysis that we've carried out with a few colleagues from the OECD, Gabriele Ciminelli, Michael Kölle, and Cyril Schwellnus. And other co-authors include my colleague from Indeed, Alexandre Jude, and a former colleague from Indeed, who is currently with the US Department of the Treasury, Tara Sinclair. Of course, everyone knows that there have been a lot of debates about remote work, and those debates really intensified over the last 2.5 years since the start of COVID. A few issues that remain hotly discussed are issues like labor productivity. Are workers more productive or less productive at home? And that's a very interesting strand of research. Another issue that's still open and evolving is the issue of worker preferences. Workers, especially in professional roles, have generally backed remote work as a way to gain flexibility, have more control over work-life balance. But that remains a debate. We've seen some highly publicized cases of worker revolt, for example, at Apple in the US, notably, where workers really opposed the company's call to get back to work. But we've also, get back to the office, I should say. But we've also seen a lot of employers taking, very different views. Elon Musk's reported email to Twitter telling everybody to go full-time into the office or get sacked is a case in point. And other questions also remain open, such as the long-term impact of remote working on innovation, or the dynamics of career advancement, or the training of young workers. What we do in our paper is actually take a step back from some of these debates, because some of these questions would really be moot if remote working was really just a temporary response to the pandemic that was really unlikely to last. But they are certainly very relevant if we believe that the current relatively high level of remote work compared to the past is more of a structural change in the labor market and the way in which people work. And so in order to start answering this question and to shed some light on it, we use data from Indeed job postings to measure the evolution of remote work since the onset of the COVID pandemic. So we compile a data set of advertised remote work on Indeed. And the reason why we think this is particularly relevant data for answering the question of whether remote work is likely to be here to stay or likely to be a temporary phenomenon is because we think that mentions of remote work as one of the characteristics of a job in a job advert represent, to a large extent, a forward-looking sort of medium-term commitment by the firm to what the job will look like in the future. The data set that we have is quite broad. It covers 20 countries. It's divided into 55 occupational sectors, and it's high frequency. So we have monthly data here, and it's also quite timely. So in the current version of the paper, we are using data through the end of September 2022. And what we do in the paper is we try to estimate the causal effect of the pandemic on advertised remote work to see really how much advertised remote work has risen since the pandemic and to what extent we can attribute that to the pandemic rather than just some longer term trend that was already present beforehand. And I won't get into the technical details too much in this presentation, but essentially we use a triple difference identification strategy. So we look at the variation in pandemic severity as the factor that potentially caused an increase in advertised remote work across time and across countries, and also across sectors. So essentially what we do is we compare sectors with low potential for remote work, sectors like hospitality or driving, for instance, with sectors that have high potential for remote work, which are essentially office type jobs in the main, and try to use that, the difference in the trends across those two groups of sectors, across countries, across time, to measure the impact of the pandemic on advertised remote work. And we also distinguish between periods of pandemic easing and tightening, basically to see first, can we measure the impact of the tightening of pandemic restrictions on remote work in job postings in the early phase of COVID-19, and then see what happens, so see what happened basically as COVID went away. And I have to say that when we wrote the first version of this paper a year ago, and we had that title of Remote Work After COVID-19, it really wasn't clear whether there would be an after COVID-19. I think it's a little clearer now that, at least in the countries that we study, COVID and COVID restrictions no longer have a major effect on the way people work. Just to preview the main findings visually, we find that the share of job ads that advertised remote work has quadrupled over the last 3 years to about 9% of job ads on average across the 20 countries we study. And we find that advertised remote work did not systematically go down significantly when the pandemic conditions eased. And we use these trends to argue that that lack of a decline as the pandemic eased and ebbed away suggests remote work is likely here to stay at a much higher level than before the pandemic. There's a lot of related literature on remote work. A lot of it uses surveys. Some of it also uses natural experiments at companies to measure the impact of remote work. Jackie mentioned Abby Adams-Prassel, who has also presented in the seminar series before. Abby has done quite a lot of work on both the feasibility and the actual realization of remote work. Some papers have, like us, have studied remote work based on online job postings, but they have typically looked at that in single countries. So the advantage that we have here is that Indeed is a global platform, and we can use data from a consistent source that looks at trends across various countries and therefore adjusts for any sort of country-specific trends that may be impacting the trends in remote working. And more broadly, online job posting data is increasingly used in labor market research on all kinds of topics, from the market power of firms to wage setting or to the response of the labor market to economic cycles. And so, for example, some of Abby's work has used data from Burning Glass, which is a commercial provider of data on online job postings. So how do we build our data set? Well, as I mentioned, we use data from 20 countries. Each of those countries has an Indeed job site. And the way we selected this group of countries is we looked at the largest OECD countries that have an Indeed site. We then identify remote work in job ads using some keywords or phrases that are either in the job title, job description, or the location of the job. So these are phrases or words like working from home, and we do that across languages. One aside, which I think is really interesting for an English-speaking audience, is that in some countries, society has started using English language phrases to denote remote work that actually don't really exist in English. So, for example, in Germany, a remote job usually uses the phrase home office, and it doesn't really refer to, setting up of a physical home office. It really refers to working from home part of the time or full time. In Italy, smart working is the kind of the main phrase used for remote work. Again, nothing to do with any kind of productivity enhancing ways of working or managing the workforce. It really means remote working. And the main variable that we use in our analysis is the share of job postings that advertise remote work. I'll tell you a little bit more about Indeed and the data, because I understand from Jackie that can be interesting to quite a lot of people. And I think it's always good to understand where the data actually comes from. The data is essentially generated by Indeed's business of being a global job site. When you enter the Indeed site as a job seeker, you see a very simple user interface. It's a bit like Google, except there are two search boxes. There is a what box where you can enter the type of job you're looking for, or just any keywords. And there's a where box where you can enter a location. You have to enter something in one of the two boxes or both. And when you click on find jobs, you get various results that the algorithm serves up depending on your search keywords. So this is an example of what happened today when I searched for delivery driver jobs in Brighton, in the south of the UK. I got a bunch of results. I could then click on specific results to get full job descriptions, and I could have applied to certain jobs if I had wanted to. But this relatively simple website generates huge amounts of data every day. We get data on the searches, so what are people actually entering into the search boxes, what filters they use. And then on the other side, on the demand side of the market, we have all the job postings and the characteristics of those job postings that may include advertised wages when that's available. That may include all kinds of other details, job title, location, other parts of the job description. Also on the supply side, we have CVs, and we also can see user behavior. So, what jobs do people click on? What jobs do they apply to? And in this specific paper, the part of this big data set that we use is the job posting side. So we basically extract information from the job title, location, and description as it relates to remote work. As I said earlier, Indeed is a global company. It's present in over 60 countries, so that lets us look at these trends across countries. One other thing that I think is quite important is that the job postings which are on Indeed include both ads that are posted directly on Indeed by Indeed's customers, which can be small or large employers, as well as job ads which are aggregated from other online sources. These may include, for instance, companies' HR websites. That data is deduplicated, And the aim, so Indeed's business aim, which I think really helps our research aim, is to capture all jobs, at least all jobs which are available online. The data can be sliced in various ways, and it's possible to do text analysis on job postings and CVs with algorithms. In our case, we don't use very sophisticated text analysis tools. We literally look up keywords and phrases and then eliminate false positives. We think that's sufficient for our purposes of identifying jobs that advertise remote work, whether it's full-time remote work or hybrid work, but other types of analysis are possible as well. And one thing I would also say is that we currently don't have micro data sets available for sharing with researchers, but we do share that micro data with central banks and other policy organizations for policy analysis. I've hinted at a few sort of advantages of this data and of online labor market data in general relative to survey sources. But these include shorter lags in the data delivery. So it really takes no longer than a few days to extract any of the variables that we use in this paper. There are a lot of observations. The data is highly granular. It's possible to apply all kinds of taxonomies to the data. The data is also from a platform that has both the supply and demand side of the online labor market. So we can get both sides of the market from a single source. And as I mentioned, it's global. Well, global is probably not the 100% accurate word, because we don't have all the countries, but we certainly have the world's major economies available to study. But there are also some shortcomings or disadvantages of using this type of data. One of them is that historical data is quite limited. We really cannot go back and say study what happened during the financial crisis of 2008, or what happened, when the last time we had a very high inflation and weak growth in the late 70s, just because either there wasn't any online labor market or the data was quite limited. Another disadvantage is that the taxonomies tend to be proprietary, so it's not always easy to match this data to external administrative or survey data sources by sector or occupation. The data may also not be representative of the population, depending on which population you're actually interested in. So for instance, in countries where Indeed has been established for a long time and has developed lots of sources of data, like the UK, the data on online job postings on Indeed is probably quite representative of the online labor market as a whole, but that may not be true in other countries, and we adjust for that in this paper. Also, the online labor markets, again, depending on the country, may not be fully representative of the whole labor market. So even if we compare, say, online job postings versus all job vacancies in an economy, there could be a difference. And finally, this is more of a supply side issue. We have limited demographic information on the user. So for instance, we see, okay, people are increasingly searching for remote work, and I'll show you a chart later on, but we don't really know who those people are. Are they men or women? Are they young or old? And so that limits, for instance, the amount of research we can do on questions like, what's the impact of remote work on equity or on diversity? On the demand side as well, we sometimes have fairly limited information on the employers themselves. So for instance, a job for, can be posted for, for a warehouse in the Midlands, but it's posted by a recruitment agency, and we actually don't know who the ultimate employer is. And so again, that makes it hard to match this data to some other sources, say on companies from company databases. Overall, in the countries where Indeed has existed for a long time, has developed good data sources, we find that there's a pretty good match between the volume of job postings on Indeed and trends in estimated job vacancies from other survey sources and statistical agencies. and that has proven quite useful during the COVID pandemic, when we could use job posting volumes as an indicator of what's happening to the labor market as a whole. But it's also important to realize a job posting is not exactly the same as a job vacancy. One posting could be, could involve multiple vacancies. And so there's not always a one-to-one match. So I hope I've caveated the data appropriately, but also I hope to have given you a taster of some of the issues that we grapple with when we try to use this data for research, as well as also a glimpse into why this data can be extremely interesting and extremely useful. In the paper, because we're measuring the impact of the pandemic on advertised remote work, we're using also a range of external variables, not from job postings, that measure the stringency of the pandemic. And that is very useful for thinking about, okay, what happened to remote work as restrictions tightened, and then what happened to remote work as restrictions eased and the pandemic went away. Let me show you some charts. So first of all, we find that at a broad level, there is kind of very high unadjusted correlation between remote work advertised in job postings and pandemic severity. On the left-hand side of this slide, you see a scatter plot at the height of the pandemic, when sort of on average, the Oxford Blavatnik index of government restrictions across this group of countries was at around 50, compared with 0 before the pandemic. And we see that in general, countries where restrictions were tighter at the height of the pandemic had a higher share of jobs that advertised remote work. On the right-hand side, when we do this for the full-time sample, which goes from 2020 to September 2022, we see a much weaker correlation. And that is kind of starting to suggest one of our results, which is that as the pandemic eased, actually the relationship between restrictions and advertised remote work began to weaken. But one major kind of shortcoming of looking at these sort of overall unadjusted shares by country is that the composition of jobs can vary by country, but also the impact of the pandemic on remote work really varies depending on the type of job that we're talking about. So what we did is we grouped our job posting occupational categories into those that are deemed to have low potential, medium potential, and high potential for remote work. And we did that using a research paper by Dingle and Nyman in the US, which sort of looked at different occupational classifications and made a judgment about, how feasible remote work in those occupations really is. So the group that has low potential includes jobs in, healthcare, transportation, hospitality, where there is a little bit of potential sometimes for remote work. So say, for example, a logistics manager or a catering manager might be able to work from home part of the time, but a truck driver, a sushi chef will really not be able to work remotely ever. And when we look at the UK data from the pandemic, at the height of the pandemic, the share of people who were working and who were working from home, I think peaked around 50% and was more like 40% during most of the bad periods of the pandemic. So that really shows, that remote work is really not available for most of the workforce. And what we find in this data on job postings is that the impact, at least from a timing perspective, the impact of the pandemic on advertised remote work was, as we had expected, much higher in those job categories that actually technically had high potential for remote work, which are, tend to be office jobs. And in particular, the category that has seen the largest increase in advertised remote work across countries was software development, but that group also includes other tech jobs and categories like finance, legal, marketing, accounting, and so forth. So what we really do in the paper to kind of go beyond these simple charts and stylized facts is to try to measure the impact of the pandemic in our triple difference approach. And essentially, our impact variable is an interaction between the kind of the national level COVID restrictions and the feasibility, the technical feasibility of remote work in a given occupation. And as I mentioned earlier, we distinguish between periods of tightening and easing of restrictions. And we also look at how each instance of a change in restrictions causes an impact on advertised remote work over time. So that's what this equation shows. We try to distinguish, to take into account the fact that there might be cultural differences across countries in the overall acceptability of remote work, or differences across countries in the mix of jobs which are available on Indeed. What we do is, for each country, we compare advertised remote work in high versus low potential occupations. And one reason why we think it's feasible to do this, why it's reasonable to do this, is because before the pandemic, the trend in advertised remote work in high and low potential occupations followed a stable and quite a similar trend. There was sort of a very slow, gradual increase, but the pandemic really accelerated that trend. So visually, what we find is that, as I've already previewed, remote work advertised in job postings increases as the pandemic becomes more severe and as government restrictions tighten. And that is true whether we use the Blavatnik Index of Government Restrictions as our explanatory variable, or whether we use other measures of the pandemic, like the mobility data from Google, or even actual health variables like the number of cases. But the share of jobs that advertise remote work does not decrease when the pandemic eases. And that holds all the way through the first 3 quarters of 2022, which is when we really saw the sharp and hopefully definitive decrease in pandemic restrictions and cases of COVID and reduced mobility. And these results, I won't go through this, but these results are robust to all kinds of robustness checks that we as economists love to do in terms of using alternative variables, looking at alternative measures of the pandemic, and placebo tests of, picking a random date in the past, say 2019, and verifying that we don't see the same results before the pandemic actually began. So in the interest of time and to allow some time for a discussion, I'll start closing with a few slides that just summarize the results and talk about how we interpret them. Just to summarize, what we do in the paper is we document a 4-fold increase in the share of job postings on Indeed that advertise remote work, which we attribute to the COVID pandemic. And that increase to date has not reversed. One interpretation of this result is that we suggest in the paper is that the pandemic triggered some kind of path dependence. So essentially, before the pandemic, there were lots and lots of jobs where remote working was feasible, but actually wasn't implemented in practice very much, and certainly wasn't advertised in job ads to the same extent. The pandemic could have triggered basically by kind of going through this phase of forced remote work, it could have basically triggered a different path for the labor market. So perhaps it did so by changing the costs and benefits of technologies like remote working, remote learning. People, maybe they didn't know how to work remotely. Now they do, and that really changes how they work by setting them on a different path. It's possible also that companies have made investments in remote work, which they were forced to do, and these investments are to some extent irreversible. They really change the fabric of the workplace. Or that essentially people also, workers, could have made irreversible investments in their family life, for instance, just arrange their life in a different way, which makes it hard to go back to non-remote ways of working. Another kind of explanation that has been proposed in the literature for why path dependency may occur is forced experimentation. So again, it's not so much that the costs and benefits of remote working have changed. They're the same as before, but there was just kind of more learning about them as a result of the pandemic. And then a third potential explanation for these results could be that because everyone had to work remotely, everyone who could, of course, everyone who had the type of job that allowed for remote work had to work remotely. That has kind of changed the equation around network effects, around how people communicate, how people innovate together, and that has shifted us to a new equilibrium. So again, all these are potential reasons for maybe why we're in a kind of permanently different equilibrium, different level of remote working that we wouldn't have reached otherwise had the pandemic not occurred. The policy implications of the argument that remote work is here to stay and that it is kind of a structural change in the labor market is that public policies, we think, should ensure that as much as possible, this shift has positive or at least neutral implications for things like productivity and worker welfare. So helping ensure that workers have access to an appropriate working environment is one policy implication. Facilitating the diffusion and learning about good managerial practices for a remote working environment is another. Making sure that people have access to actual digital infrastructure that's fast, that's reliable, including in rural areas where broadband networks are typically not as strong, and including in lower income households, which may not have been able to make the appropriate investments in remote work, are also some implications. And finally, investing in digital skills. So making sure that maybe people who haven't gone through the forced experimentation phase, but do have access to occupations that where remote work is feasible, actually have the skills to be able to take those jobs. So we leave open the question of, of regulation. I think that's something that's really open for discussion. For instance, certain companies, certainly in the tech sector, have addressed some of these things in the absence of regulations by either purchasing equipment for workers or giving workers salary supplements if they're working from home so that they can set up an appropriate environment. But different countries are addressing this very differently, also from a work-life balance and well-being standpoint. One thing that we do see as a clear trend, which I guess speaks to some of the welfare or the well-being aspects of remote work, is that searches for remote work have risen since the pandemic started and actually remained quite high relative to historical levels. So this is an example from the UK. This is a chart which shows the share of all searches on Indeed, which includes keywords related to remote work or working from home. On the vertical axis, you have the percent, so it goes from 0 to 3%. And the time scale here goes from January 2020 through the end of October 2022. If we were to extend this line further in the past, it would have been fairly flat at the early 2020 level. But what we've really seen since the start of COVID is that, if anything, the share of searches that include remote working keywords is stable or even perhaps rising, and is currently at 2.7%. Now, 2.7% may sound like very little, but keep in mind, first of all, that many people who search for jobs that cannot be remote, cannot be done from home. So, for instance, if we think that maybe only a third of workers who search for jobs might actually be getting a job that is teleworkable, then this is 2.7 out of 30 or 40 rather than 2.7 out of 100. And also, a lot of people, when they search for a job, they really search for an occupation first and foremost, or for a location, and then often, only include remote working keywords when they narrow down their search. So I think what's important here is the relative shift from the pre-pandemic level, which was quite low and gradually rising, but not very rapidly, to something which is 10 times higher. But this interest in remote work in job searches does also suggest that it's not just that employers are advertising remote work to a larger extent than before. Actually, job seekers are also expressing an interest in those jobs. So there seems to be, it seems likely that at some point, a longer term equilibrium would involve some kind of agreement between the supply and demand side of the labor market. The other interesting trend, and this is really the last chart in my presentation, is that the rise of remote work that's advertised in job postings may have some interesting implications for cross-border mobility of people and potentially of jobs as well. So one interesting trend that we see on Indeed is that when we look at Europe's major economies like Germany, France, and the UK, the share of searches that include remote work keywords is much higher among job seekers which are based outside these countries than among domestic job seekers. So essentially, in other words, foreign job seekers actually represent quite a high share of searches for remote jobs and are quite interested in those jobs. So for employers, that might suggest that, if they can overcome sort of technical, tax, and legal barriers, they might, for certain jobs, have access to a much wider pool of potential workers. And that for domestic job seekers, it might mean that the pool of people they compete with may potentially be much greater in some of those jobs that are really fully remote. I personally don't think, for the time being, that we're seeing a major shift in this direction. A lot of the jobs that we tag as remote in our data set still have a physical domestic city location in the job posting, which does suggest that a lot of employers still want people to work on a hybrid basis, or still want their workers to be at least within the orbit of an office to some extent, or they may not be ready to deal with the legal and tax implications of really having a global workforce, or they're not ready for the HR and cultural implications of that. So there are lots of reasons why I don't think that all tech jobs in the UK will all of a sudden be, have workers who are outside the UK. But it is an interesting trend that we're seeing, and something that might represent a change on the margin. So I'll stop here. If anyone is interested in reading the full paper, I've included the QR code here. And if anyone is interested in other research and data that we publish, please feel free to check out our website at hiringlab.org. We also have certain data series that we share publicly on GitHub. These are our job posting trackers, which tracks the overall volume of job postings across countries, and our new Indeed wage tracker, which tracks advertised wages and salaries in job postings in 7 European countries. And that's available for anyone to share. we plan to build out a more comprehensive data portal where we'll have more data series which are available for research. But for now, I'll stop here. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Pawel. That was excellent. And do you want to stop sharing your screen, maybe? Yeah, it's exactly what I wanted to find, to show what kinds of data you can get that you can use. I've already got lots of questions coming up. So shall I, first of all, Jonathan Haskell, would you like to open your mic? I know a lot of people know who you are, but let's assume some people don't. So if you'd like to briefly introduce yourself and ask your question, it's Petra.
Thanks so much, Jackie. Jonathan Haskell, Imperial College and Bank of England, and you kindly invited me to speak last time in the series, so thank you for that. Pawel, thank you. That was an incredibly interesting presentation. I think the answer to my question might be buried deep in your econometrics, for which apologies, but let me try my question anyway. It seems to me there are two ways of thinking about the working from home. One is it is, as you've been describing, a regime change. For some reason in the past, a coordination problem, we didn't think we could work from home. Now it's been proved that we can work from home. The other, and it's a permanent regime change and it's here to stay. The other hypothesis is it's nothing to do with that. It's just to do with labor market tightness, that actually as we recovered from the recession, for reasons we still don't quite understand, the labor market got very tight. Workers were in a position, who could work from home, were in a position to bargain with their employers. And one of the things they were able to bargain was working from home. And that has the interesting implication that if the market becomes less tight, then working from home is not here to stay because workers can't bargain it. Now, presumably you could get at that by, interacting measures of vacancies and labor market tightness and this, that, and the other in your very, very interesting econometrics. And forgive me, maybe you did that and I just didn't see it, but I'd be very interested if you had any reflections on that. And again, thanks for incredibly clear and interesting presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's great to see you. Yeah, it's a really, really interesting question, and certainly, yeah, another perspective on what we might be seeing. As the labor market tightness eases, it will be really interesting to watch what happens. So I guess in our econometrics, we do focus on the difference, measure the difference in remote work across the two groups of occupations, the kind of the high remote and low remote groups. So I think that to the extent that there are sort of national level changes or differences in labor market tightness, then that should be controlled for in that comparison. I think I think where we might want to add a labor market tightness variable is where if we think that the kind of tightness has increased as during the recovery from the pandemic more in the high remote jobs than in low remote jobs. But when we look at the job posting data itself and the trends, it seems like the opposite holds. The job categories where we've seen the biggest increases in postings during the pandemic and during the recovery from the pandemic have tended to be the lower paid non-remote jobs in driving, warehousing, healthcare. But it's certainly something that we might try to incorporate into the econometrics and take a look at that more formally.
Could I just, before Petros comes in, could I just supplement the question? If you had 2.7% increase of all job searches for remote working, I don't know where I could see the graph on how the proportion of employers had that increased, and if so, by what percent, just to get a rough idea of the overall proportion within that sample of data of employers looking for remote workers. Oops.
Yeah, so I'll share my screen again. So this is the chart that you were just referencing on the search side. So it went from sort of 3.4% to 2.7. So increased sort of 7 to 8 times if my on the fly maths is correct. In terms of the increase on the posting side, the chart I showed was the average across the 20 countries, which was an increase from 2 to about 9%. So it's more or less a fourfold increase. So the increase, and it's quite similar for the UK itself as well. So in the UK, about 1 in 10, 1 in 11 job postings right now advertise remote work explicitly. So in terms of the increase has been greater on the search side in sort of shared terms than on the job posting side.
The increase has been greater in terms of search than on job offers.
Yes.
But I suppose to supplement Jonathan's hypotheses of possible explanations, I mean, a third one would be whether, to what extent are employers seeing remote working as a really good way to save costs? So you don't have to pay for offices, etc., heating and all the rest of it. So you may want to have a business model that promotes that. So it might not be employees negotiating better conditions, but it's firms having a particular model, a business model. But is there much evidence really of that in the data you've got there? I can't really see it.
It's a really interesting question. I think the cost side is something that's quite difficult for us to get at in this paper. You know, a lot of the job ads that mention remote work don't necessarily refer to jobs which are 100% remote. A lot of them specifically say, you know, it's really hybrid work, it's remote work, you know, X numbers of days a week, which so I don't think it's necessarily clear to what extent it generates cost savings or not. I think that would be a really interesting question to study. We are hearing, you know, about reductions in office space. We're hearing about, you know, certain jobs moving away from city centers to elsewhere. I don't think that's something that we can really address fully with this specific data. Some employers have also supplemented salaries of workers to help them with costs like heating and electricity and broadband internet at home. But I suspect that's probably not the bulk of employers who have remote workers.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I'm going to stop in a minute. It's like a polarization argument. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? So are some remote workers the privileged ones, or are they the ones that are really at the forefront of being exploited because they have to use their own resources at home? There's a question there, but I could end up talking for too long. So let me hand over to Petros. And Petros, could you introduce yourself to those of you who don't know us and ask your question, please?
Well, yes, of course. Thank you, Jackie. Nice to see everyone. I'm Petros Komakiotis. I'm an associate fellow, I think, for Digit. So I used to be at Sussex for a few years, and I'm now based in Madrid at the SAP Business School. I'm an associate professor of management here, and my expertise is in virtual teams, remote working, hybrid working, digital platforms, online communities, and everything has technology as a common denominator, everything that I do from a research perspective. So I just want to offer a comment. Thank you for the presentation, first of all, Pawel. I think it was very robust as a study. I really enjoyed it. I just wanted to add a perspective that I didn't feel that you focused on, and that's it. That's the perspective on, if you like, the variety of different types of remote work, because we tend to treat remote work as a one-size-fits-all thing, that as a single thing, whereas in reality, remote work has been around for a very long time in very, very different formats. So I don't have much to say based on virtual teams. For example, we see different types and new types of virtual teams that have emerged due to the lockdowns. That have very, very different configurational characteristics in comparison to virtual teams as we knew them before the pandemic. So I even have written a blog article for Digit, which I can share here in the chat in case it is of interest, in case you think it might enrich your study. And this is just what I just wanted to do a bit of a self-promotion of my own work. Because I think it truly relates to what you did, and I think it might enrich it in some ways.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a really interesting question of, you know, how has remote work actually evolved, and, you know, are there different types of remote work? I think to some extent it also relates to Jackie's point about, you know, maybe some remote workers being, you know, in a really good position where they they have a great setup. You know, the firm is very effective at managing a remote workforce, and their costs are fully covered. And others may be in the opposite situation. So I think there are sort of different aspects of the same question about the nature of remote work. I think there's little we can say about that with our current data set. As I mentioned, you know, right now we're not even differentiating between full-time remote work and hybrid work, which, you know, I can imagine can be very different from an organizational perspective in terms of the location of workers and how often and how they interact with their colleagues, clients, suppliers, etc. So I'm not sure we can say very much about this yet. I mean, I suppose applying, you know, other forms of text analysis, we could see if we can glimpse anything from job ads about, you know, really how firms talk about remote work. Do they just say, you know, work from home 2 days a week? Or do they really say, you know, we're using certain tools, we have certain setups, we combine remote work with these other types of non-remote work? So I think that is potentially an area of research that would be interesting.
Thank you. I have one last question, Rachel Verdon, but your camera doesn't work. Do you want to ask your question just without the camera, Rachel? Or do you want me to?
Yes, yeah. It was just a quick one, really.
Please.
Yes, so I'm Rachel Verdon. I'm a research fellow from the Digit Centre, and it was really interesting. And I just wonder if there's any way of using the information that you have to measure kind of any of these intersectional characteristics of people who are searching, bearing in mind, you know, what we're told in terms of how these, you know, changes around remote work are changing access to work for perhaps women or people with disabilities, or, you know, is there any way of identifying information from the data or not?
Yeah, another great question. Not really. So as I mentioned when I was talking a bit about the shortcomings of online job posting data, is that, you know, we don't have a lot of information about the demographics of the job seekers. We do have some information about the subset of job seekers who uploaded their CV to Indeed and they search while they're logged in through their account. So for instance, we can see where, you know, which region of their country they're based in, what education level they have, what you know, what is their current or most recent job title. And we do see, when we look at that data, that you know, people searching for remote work do on average tend to have you know, professional jobs in, you know, currently or in their past career, and have a higher level of education. So I don't think that's surprising, in the sense that, you know, it also matches the distribution of jobs that are available for remote or hybrid work as well, which do tend to be the higher paying this type jobs that typically require a higher level of qualifications. But we don't have any data right now on, you know, things like gender, age. We can infer from, you know, when people finish their education, but that's not perfect either. So I think this whole question of, yeah, the inequalities in access to remote work is something where we can observe that there's certainly huge inequality across professions, across occupations, but it's really hard for us to judge kind of to what extent that's true across you know, other demographic variables.
Well, Pawel, I think I'm going to have to bring it to a close now, as we're approaching 2 o'clock and people are starting to leave. There are obviously so many more questions to want to ask, like about the implication for government policy on digital skills and infrastructures, and how they affect who can and can't access them. Can I thank very much you for coming and giving an absolutely excellent presentation. It's been really interesting. Thank you. And to the audience as well for great questions, and to the ESRC for funding us. Thank you very much.